Well, good morning, folks. It's great to see you this morning. What a beautiful Lord's Day morning in Middle Tennessee. We are blessed. Thanks for being here this morning. We're studying in this Sunday morning class the book of Ecclesiastes. We took a sort of an overview of the books we call the wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Job. Those are the 5 books of the Old Testament that we have designated as wisdom literature in the Old Testament. We did kind of a cursory just overview of those other books, but we decided we'd dive a little deeper into the book of Ecclesiastes. It's got there's a lot of truth in Ecclesiastes. Really makes you stop and think about life. But there's also the danger that the book of Ecclesiastes is misused. And there's some phrases and sections in the book that people will take out of context and force an interpretation that actually contradicts with other things in the Scripture. And so I think it's worth having a good working knowledge of the book of Ecclesiastes. Those of you who are visiting with us, this chart we've had on the screen every week because I think it is so critical in understanding the book of Ecclesiastes to know that Solomon does 2 things. One thing, he looks at life just purely from a this world perspective. Just as a carnal man, without any spiritual thought in his mind, he views life. And of course, that's a very negative consideration. And then he flips over and he begins to talk about life with God in view from a spiritual perspective. And so then things are different in his. And you've got to know contextually in which section you are in order to make a proper understanding of what Solomon is saying. This is our designation, but most commentators call the different sections of the book sermons. And I'm sure they started calling it that because Ecclesiastes is the preacher, the message from the preacher. What does a preacher do? A preacher preaches sermons. And so you got 4 sermons. In each of the 4 sections or 4 sermons, there are 2 parts. The first part, life without God. The second part, with life with God in view. And so there are some trigger words that we look for to sort of see when he switches from one consideration to the other, so that we can kind of pick up on his mindset in the various sections of the book. So last week, we're down here, we finished last week chapter 5, of course, which was him speaking about God in view. That was the end of the so-called second sermon, and we're ready for the third so-called sermon beginning in chapter 6. That's where we are today. So let's read the first part of chapter 6. Chapter 6, Ecclesiastes chapter 6. There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. Now stop there just for a minute. There's one of our trigger phrases, under the sun. Where is under the sun? Under the sun is here on earth, right? That's our human physical existence, right? And so that would tell us that he's going into a section now where he's just going to talk about things viewed from a purely physical perspective. Okay, so let's start again. Chapter 6, verse 1, There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men, a man to whom God hath given riches, wealth, and honor, so that he wanteth nothing for his soul of all that he desireth. Yet God giveth him not power to eat thereof, but a stranger eateth it. This is vanity, and it is an evil disease. If a man beget 100 children, and live many years, so that the days of his years be many, and his soul be not filled with good, and also that he have no burial, I say that an untimely birth is better than he. For he cometh in with vanity, and departeth in darkness, and his name shall be covered with darkness. Moreover, he hath not seen the sun, nor known anything. This hath more rest than the other. Yea, though he live 1,000 years twice told, yet hath he seen no good. Do not all go to one place? All right, so let's stop there and make a few considerations of that section. Now, notice that he does mention there, especially in verse 2, he throws the name God in a couple times, but I don't think he's thinking about God particularly. He's just thinking about the terrible situation of a man who gets lots of stuff. He accumulates a lot of stuff. He has riches, wealth, and honor, but he doesn't have the power to enjoy it. I think that's what's meant by the expression, he hath not power to eat thereof, but a stranger eateth it. Now, a lot of things could cause that outcome, right? So I get a bunch of money, but any number of things could happen to it. Somebody could rob me of my money. Maybe I make a bad investment with my money and lose it all. Or maybe just about as soon as I've acquired wealth, I get sick and I'm just so miserably ill and die, and I never got to enjoy all that I worked to accumulate. Those kind of things are common in the world, right? That happens. And so Solomon is sort of describing a situation like that. And he says, a stranger eateth it. So for whatever reason, somebody else comes to possess the wealth that he had accumulated. He didn't get to enjoy it. Somebody else is going to enjoy it. He says this is an evil disease. This is a very troubling thing. This is bad business. When that sort of thing happens, in a fellow's life, he says it's an evil disease. This is bad business. And then he goes on to describe this guy blessed in other ways. Verse 3, he begets 100 children. He lives many years. But his soul's not filled with good, that he have no burial. I say that an untimely birth is better than him. In fact, this long life that he's describing, and obviously this is hyperbole, this is exaggeration for emphasis. What if he lived 1,000 years twice told? He lived 2,000 years. Nobody ever lived 2,000 years. Even Methuselah didn't live quite 1,000 years, so nobody's ever lived 2,000. But he said if a man did live 2,000 years, and he has 100 children, and yet he doesn't enjoy that, he's not able to accept or receive the benefit of all that comes. He says it all comes with vanity and departs in darkness. His name shall be covered with, get that last part of verse 4. His name shall be covered with darkness. I think what that means is he's forgotten. He had all this and he lived this long and he had so many children and he died. What happens to him when he dies? His name is covered in darkness. We've talked about this before, but I'm always moved by the consideration of my own ancestors. So here's the example I've used before. I know my parents' names. I know my grandparents' names. But I don't even know the names of all of my great-grandparents. So that's just 1, 2, 3 generations back. 3 generations in my own family ancestry. And I don't know the names of those. I don't even know the names of those people, much less know anything about their lives. And then if you go back any further than that, obviously I don't know anything. Now, these days, I have run into people who get on some of these websites like Ancestry.com and so forth, and they do a lot of research about their family names, and so maybe they know a little bit more about their, but typically we don't. Typically what happens? Well, what he says there, your name is covered in darkness. In other words, you're going to die and be forgotten. That's the simple way of putting it, right? You're going to die and be forgotten. If you lived 2,000 years, had 100 children, and accumulated all kinds of wealth and benefits, and you died, ultimately you're going to be dead and forgotten. And this is a real frustration in Solomon's view. He called it an evil disease. He called it a vanity. Other places he talked about being vexed by these kind of thoughts. Here's a guy who had it all. And I don't know. I honestly don't know. We know the names of some of Solomon's children, but we don't know how many. We don't really, I don't think, know how many children he had. But he had, 700 wives and 300 concubines? It's quite possible he had 100 children. I would not be surprised to know that Solomon fathered 100 children. And he certainly had all the wealth that could possibly be imaginable. But he said, I'm going to die and be forgotten. Somebody else is going to eat what I have received. And so he's real troubled by that. Now, What would that mean for us? We're never going to live 2,000 years. We're never going to have 100 children. We're never going to have the kind of wealth, accumulated wealth that Solomon had. We couldn't even come close. We couldn't, as they say, hold a candle to Solomon in those regards. If it didn't satisfy Solomon in the pursuit of these earthly things, you think it will satisfy you? You're not going to get what he had. You're not even going to come close to what he had. But even at that level, it didn't satisfy. You think it's going to satisfy us? No, it's going to be vanity and vexation. You are not going to be satisfied with that. In fact, he uses an expression there, an untimely birth is better than he. What's an untimely birth? Stillborn. I think newer versions may even use that expression. A stillborn child is better than. Here's a guy who lived 2,000 years, but he didn't enjoy anything about his life. He said it would have been better for this person, a stillborn child is in a better condition than he is in that regard. And he uses some expressions there. He had not seen the sun nor known anything. So, here's a child that just simply didn't make it in life. But Solomon regarded him in a more favorable light than the other fella, which, that's, if you stop to analyze it, that's a very down and depressed view of human existence, isn't it? But, it is what it is. It is the reality of what Solomon perceived, coming from a position more qualified than anybody else to analyze it, right? Solomon, with all of his wealth and status and position, he could say these things from experience better than anybody else, and he's telling us just pursuing life and the things of life, just a worldly pursuit, he says, is just not satisfying. All right. Again, obviously, he says that the stillborn child is better than the guy who had lived for so long. He says something there in verse 6. What do you think of me? Yea, though he live 1,000 years twice told, yet hath he seen no good. Do not all go to one place. Now, remember, he's actually described two characters in this section. The stillborn child and the man who lived 2,000 years and had 100 children. Lots of wealth. Do not all go to one place. What's the one place he's talking about? Yeah, the grave. The grave. All die and go to... No, everybody's going to die, right? I think that again sort of tips us off that he's just looking at it from a purely this world perspective, because beyond the grave, it's not true that all go to just one place. You could, as someone said, you could generalize it and say the Hadean realm. But even we know that within Hades, there's a place of paradise and comfort, Abraham's bosom, and there's a place of great torment. So, the idea that it's all equal at death is not true, but that's what he says there. That statement could be used to contradict other statements to say we don't all go to one place, right, in the Bible. And so we have to be able to explain it from looking at this perspective of Solomon that we keep referring to on this chart. His perspective in this section is life viewed without God in the picture. All right. Any thoughts or comments on any of that? All right. Let's read to the end of the chapter then at verse 7. All the labor of a man is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not filled. For what hath the wise more than the fool? What hath the poor that knoweth to walk before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the desire. This is also vanity and vexation of spirit. That which hath been is named already, and it is known that it is man. Neither may he contend with him that is mightier than he. Seeing there be many things that increase vanity, what is man the better? For who knoweth what is good for a man in this life? all the days of his vain life, which he spendeth as a shadow. For who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun? All right. So, the man who lives only for self and only for what he can acquire for himself, all the labor of a man is for his mouth. I don't think that means he's just working totally for, more and more food. Obviously, food would be a part of that, but that's just sort of an expression denoting it's all for my consumption. Everything I'm doing all of my labor is for my personal gratification. That's what I'm working for. I'm working to gratify myself, and yet the appetite is not filled. But I never get satisfied with that. I make more, I buy more, I get more, and then the result of that is I want even more. I never reach a point of satisfaction where it is enough. Because if you stop and think about it, if this life is all there is, if there's nothing beyond this life, then I need to get everything I can just as fast as I can and grab more and more as fast as I can, because this is all there is. And when I'm dead, it's over. Some of you who are older might remember an old beer commercial. I don't even know which brand of beer it was, but they were sort of famous 30 or 40 years ago for saying, grab for all the gusto you can get. You remember that, Jeff? Grab for all the gusto you can get. But that was the view of living for the moment, living for our human existence. Get all you can get. You might as well. If this is all there is, you better get it as fast as you can. Because if you don't get it real fast, you're going to be so old that you won't be able to enjoy it when you do get it. Get it now. Get it fast. Get as much as you can. Solomon says you'll never be satisfied. Your appetite will never be quenched in that pursuit. Jeff?
We've probably all known older people that, rich people, farmers or whatever, that were millionaires. I did, and they wouldn't spend a dime for anything.
Yeah.
Money didn't do them any good. They just wanted more and more.
Yeah.
They didn't have God in their lives, and they were never satisfied.
Yeah. So
God left it all to someone else.
exactly right. And in our world, they were pretty rich people. They weren't near as rich as Solomon, but they were experiencing exactly the same thing that Solomon experienced. Exactly right. All right. So he says, now this should tip us off in verse 8. What hath the wise more than the fool? Well, in this section, he's suggesting that a wise person is no better off than a fool. That's not true, is it? Isn't wisdom, for instance, how many times in the book of Proverbs did Solomon say, seek wisdom, pursue wisdom? It's a blessing to be. We should seek to be wise. Here he says, wise man is no better off than a fool. So again, know the contextual setting in which he makes that statement. We know that's not a true, from a spiritual perspective, that's not a true observation. So he's just talking about life without God. What hath the poor that knoweth to walk before the living? Again, the poor and the rich, he says pretty much it just all washes out. Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the desire, for this also is vanity and vexation of spirit. There's again, trigger phrase, vanity and vexation of spirit. How would you say that in your own mind? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the desire. I suggested that maybe we had one of our modern day proverbs, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the desire. No, the sight of the eyes is what I've got right here. I can see it. It's what I've got in my hand is better than what I'm looking around hoping to get. So he says, I think that's the meaning there in verse 9. Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering desire. This is also vanity and vexation of spirit. In other words, if you're just constantly trying to get to the next thing, you're just vexing yourself. No satisfaction in that. Now, verse 10 in this section, I think verse 10 is the hardest verse in this section. That which hath been is named already, and it is known that it is man. Neither may he contend with him that is mightier than he. That's to me a little bit harder phrase to understand. I want to read it to you from a couple other versions. The New American Standard says, whatever exists has already been named, and it is known what man is, for he cannot dispute with him who is stronger than he. The New International Version, which I never reference without saying I don't always like the New International Version. It's not always accurate. I think it's good here. It says, whatever exists has already been named, and what man is has been known. No one can contend with one who is stronger than he. All right. So, the idea of that, I believe, is there's nothing new under the sun. That's a common expression. We use it, don't we? When we're not even talking Bible verses or phrases, we sometimes, there's nothing new under the sun. You know, someone says, you won't believe what happened to me last week. And you might respond to, well, there's nothing new under the sun. You know, my car broke down and I had 3 flat tires in one day. Ah, there's nothing new under the sun. You know, I've had that before myself. That just happens, you know. There's nothing new under the sun. That's the expression here. What has been is named already. In other words, whatever happens, it's already been experienced before. There's nothing new. And it's known to man. That is, there's no new experiences. There's nothing different. It is known what man is. That's just he's saying that's just the reality of human existence. Now, neither may he contend with him that is mightier than he. Or, as the New American Standard says, he cannot dispute with him who is stronger than he is. I think what he has in mind there is you can't fight. Well, what expression will we use? Maybe fate, or you just can't fight against what's going to be. An expression we use so often currently is, it is what it is. You know, how often do you hear people say, it is what it is? And the idea of that is it just happens, and you can't stop it from happening. It is what it is. And so basically he's saying everything that's happening in your life has happened to somebody else before. It's all common in human experience, and you can't change it. You can't fight it. You can't make it be different. It is what it is. It's our existence here on the earth. It's just the way life is. In many senses, I suppose that is true for everybody, you know, because our human existence is such. What do we live? We live for so long. We get sick. We get old. We die. It is what it is. You can't fight that. I mean, death is certain. The old expression there, the only thing certain in life are death and taxes. You can't change that. It is what it is. That's what he's saying here. We think we can improve on that, don't we? From what we know of God and His will for us, we believe that we can make our existence here on this earth better. Now, we're still going to get old and sick and die, but we believe that the time spent here can be improved by living like God wants us to live. But here he's just saying, you can't fight it. You can't fight it. It is the human existence, and it's going to turn out that way no matter what you do. I think verse 10 is the little bit harder verse there in this section, but I believe that's what he is saying. He says, seeing there be many things that increase vanity, what is man the better? Now, the many things that increase vanity, most newer translations are going to say that the many things that increase vanity, that's what the King James Version says. But notice the New American Standard Version says, there are many words that increase futility. The more the words, the less the meaning. How does that profit anyone? A newer translation says. So here he's saying, we can talk about this till we're blue in the face and we're not going to change it. Right? You can talk about this futile struggle of a man's life. We're just like a hamster in a wheel. We're just running and running and running. We're not getting anywhere. And we can talk about that endlessly and it doesn't change it. It's just going to be that way. I believe that's what he's saying there, right? The many things. You might make a note in your margin there if you're reading the King James as I am. Seeing there be many things or many words. Most other versions say words. There are many words. A lot of talk about this, but it doesn't change anything. Who knoweth, verse 12, the last verse of the chapter. Who knoweth what is good for man in this life? All the days of his vain life that he spendeth as a shadow. For who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun? Is that a true statement? Do you really believe that? Who knoweth what is good for man in this life? I think I do, don't you? I think I know what's good for a man in this life. Solomon himself says at the end of this book, let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. So Solomon going to get to the right answer to that question, but he asks a question right here that suggests the answer is not discoverable. Who knows? Who knows what is good for a man in this life? We know. Jeff?
The only reason we do know, Greg, is because God tells us.
That's right. And so with information from God, we can answer that question, but he's not thinking about God. And he asks a question and the implication is, here's an unanswerable question for you. What's good for Jeff, what's best for your life? You don't know. You couldn't figure that out in a million. Yes, you can. As you just said, we know because God told us. But Solomon right here is not thinking that way. And so he says, it's an unanswerable question. What's best for a man in this life? Because he's not thinking about God. Isn't that sort of a depressing expression? Who knows what's good for a man in this life? All the days of his vain life which he spends as a shadow. Your life is like a shadow, he says. What mental picture does that draw for us? Life is like a shadow. Well, say again? Only lasts briefly, exactly. There's no substance to it. You know, a shadow, it's there, but you can't reach down and touch it. You can't grab it. There's no substance to it. There's nothing that you can get hold of. And usually shadows are typically ill-defined. You know, maybe I can see a little shadow. I'm moving my hand here and that light up there is casting a little shadow, but it's not very distinct. I can't make it out real clear that I can see it. And that's the way shadows are. And he says that's the way life is. So life has no substance. It's fleeting or short-lived. It's ill-defined. It rapidly changes. He says that's how life is. Totally a depressed and discouraged outlook from Solomon in this first section of the third sermon, as we call it, life without God, vanity, vexation. All right. Any thoughts on that? I think that if you just read these certain sections of the book of Ecclesiastes, you could go away in a deep fit of depression. And I think Solomon must have been in such a state of mind, at least at times in his life. To even be able to pen those kind of words suggests to you that he went through those phases. He experienced that. He certainly felt that way at various times in life. All right, so chapter 6 ends with a question. Who knows what's good for man in this life? He asks a question with the implication you couldn't answer it. But then chapter 7 begins with him answering what is good. So if you look at our chart again, you see a flip-flop, right? Now he's going to talk about it now he's going to get it right. He's going to talk about it from the godly perspective. And you know this section. This is a very famous section from the book of Ecclesiastes. It's often used at funerals. And we'll talk about why. Let's read here about the first 8 verses. A good name is better than a precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression maketh a wise man mad, and a gift destroyeth the heart. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. All right. A good name, the first thing that he mentions here, let's make sure that we do understand that we are in this second section, that he's talking about life, God in the picture, seeing God, serving God. Starts out because you see it as sort of a total change in his mindset. By the time you get down to verse 13, he'll say, consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? In the day of prosperity he's joyful, but in the day of adversity consider God also has set the one over against another. We'll talk to those verses, but he mentions God in reality in this section. So again, know that we're in that kind of a part of the passage. A good name is better than precious ointment. Precious ointment, as we understand it back in those times, certain kinds of ointments that were made, maybe made from very rare substances, was of great value. You remember when Jesus was anointed with precious ointment, and Judas complained, we could have used this for maybe to feed the poor or whatever. And of course, we know, and it is explained to us, that he wasn't sincere about that. He was just hoping to get his hands on the money because he controlled the bag or the treasury of the group. He had their common funds, and he was wanting that so he could probably embezzle it and use it for his own purposes. So precious ointment was just sort of something that people back, we don't think about that, a woman might buy a bottle of perfume. You can buy some real expensive perfumes, but we wouldn't even think about spending the kind of money that you could spend on perfume. But that's not so common for us, the idea of precious ointment, but to the people back then, that would have been an understandable expression. Precious ointment is something of great value. What's more value? Having a good name. I could make some money on this deal. I could potentially make a good bit of money on this deal. I'd have to do some underhanded things to get it done. But I could make some good money on this proposition. When people find out, and people will ultimately find out that I did this dirty deal, and when they find out, it's going to trash my reputation. It is. I know that. But I have this potential to make a bunch of money. And later when it comes out and my reputation is tarnished by it, that's what will happen. But man, I'm going to grab the money right now. No, Solomon said, no. He says, that's not the one. He says, a better name, a good name. It's better to maintain your reputation, have a good name, than it is to acquire wealth. We need to know that. I think we know that. I think in our heart of hearts we know that that's true. But that needs to be a governing principle of our lives, right? I'd rather be able to maintain my honesty, my personal honesty, my own clear conscience, and my reputation among others, I'd rather preserve my name than to enrich myself. We just obviously need to live by that principle. We understand that.
There's certain things, Greg, that Christians, they just be better off there's certain occupations. I always thought, be a car salesman. I like cars, and keep out of the new models and everything. But a car salesman has a bad reputation. And this would be a bad job for Christians to have.
Okay. So, in other words, you maybe could have made a good living in pursuing something like that, but there would be people, and I don't think it's just inevitable that a car dealer does dirty dealings, but so many have that if someone said, yeah, there's Gordon, he's a Christian, he's a used car salesman. What? So there'd be some reaction that, what? That doesn't sound right. Other things, what's our old saying about politicians? How can you tell when a politician's lying? If you see his lips moving, there are certain occupations with such bad reputation, you may not want to be any part of that, because a good name is better than anything of that nature. Now, here's evidence that he has changed his viewpoint. The day of death is better than the day of one's birth. Well, in the previous chapter, he said it'd be better not to be born at all. Now he's saying the day of death is better than the day of birth because you have lived life, you've experienced life, you've been blessed in life, you've lived a good life, you've had a good reputation. You can die satisfied, gratified. Here's the section we always use. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. So you got two options here. You can go to a party, you can go to a funeral. Where's the greater benefit? Now, that's not saying that you might not enjoy a party, and it's not saying that a party is necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, some parties can be bad things, but we have parties, right? And they're good and they're enjoyable. It's not a bad thing to go to a party. He says it's better to go to a funeral. Why is it better to go to a funeral? Because at the funeral, I'm going to be forced to deal with the concept of my own mortality, right? When I go to a funeral, I have to acknowledge the fact one of these days I'm going to be the guy in the coffin. One of the days it's going to be my funeral. If I went to a party, I just had fun and it was enjoyable, but when I came away from it, I hadn't really gained anything of spiritual significance. But when I go to a funeral, if I'm paying attention, I gain something that will help me in the way I think about life in general. Tom, do you have a thought?
That's what I was concept of perspective.
Yeah.
One puts reality in front of you, and the other one sort of lets reality sort of take a second.
Yeah, that's why we have parties, is sort of to escape reality, isn't it? If we get together and we just, let's say that we have a potluck or a pitch-in dinner at the park. For that period of time, we don't have to think about negative things of life. We can just enjoy it. We can kind of put other thoughts and worries out of mind and just enjoy the moment. That's fine. But at the funeral, you're forced to think about it. Tom?
The other thought there before with the birth and death, when a new child is born, you're really happy, but you really don't know what's in store for that child. You can provide them with everything, and they could, they could end up being a miserable individual. But at death, if the person lived a right life, they can look back on it and say, it was really good for that, for us to have known that person and he lived. He had an impact on my life.
Yeah,
So
I think that's right.
That's the concept. There's one that you can put in perspective. The other one is sort of an unknown. You don't know what is going to be there.
Okay, all right. Same meaning, I think, in verse 3. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. I think that's the same truth, just repeated in a different way. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. So all of that, I think, through verse 4 is just emphasizing the same thought. It is better, verse 5, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Again, he's contrasting something better than the other. It's better. So here's a wise fella. He's a spiritually mature man. And he comes to me and he rebukes me. He says, Greg, now, what you're doing is not right. And it's not going to work out for you. And you're going to really suffer for this. And your family's going to suffer for this. And you're putting your soul in spiritual peril. You need to wake up and realize that, okay. He said, I'd be better to listen to that guy, the rebuke of the wise, than for a man to hear the song of fools as the crackling of thorns under a pot. So is the laughter of a fool. You ever burn any thorn, especially the branches of a thorn tree, but even the heavier parts of it? There are some kinds of woods that just pop and throw sparks out. Around these parts, we like to burn bodock or Osage orange. And boy, I'm telling you, it'll spray you with sparks, won't it, Richard? I mean, when it burns, it pops. Do the pops do anything? When it pops and throws the sparks out, it doesn't do anything but maybe burn a hole in your jacket when you're trying to load the fire. There's no benefit to the popping of the crackling of the wood. It's not making more heat that way. So he's saying there's nothing to be gained from hearing what the fool has to say. You'd be better off to listen to the rebuke of the wise man. So that's, pretty straightforward, obvious thing there. I think we can make sense of that. Verse 7, surely oppression maketh a wise man mad, and a gift destroyeth the heart. So what he's saying there is the gift destroyeth the heart. Other versions make that clearer. A bribe destroys the heart. Oppression makes a wise man mad. That is, it's very discouraging to a wise man to see the oppression that exists in the world. I think other versions, I think it's basically the same, the oppression or extortion. So I think maybe he's talking about people who extort money from others. Oppression maketh a wise man mad. A gift or a bribe destroys the heart. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. It's better to see a thing through, basically, is what he is saying there. You remember in Luke chapter 14 when Jesus talked about a man who sets out to build a tower, but he hasn't thought about how much it's going to cost to complete his construction project. And so he gets started and then he can't finish. That makes him look bad, right? Do you remember in 1 Kings chapter 20, King Ahab in Israel was being challenged by the king of Syria, and he said something of the order, better is the man who takes off his armor than who puts it on. It's one thing to put on your armor, but he says if you win the fight and at the end you're able to take your armor off, so the taking off of the armor is better than the putting on of armor, meaning it's better if you finish a thing successfully. And that's what he is saying here. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. So if you can stick with something, see it through to the end is better than the beginning, and the patience to see it through is beneficial, is what he's suggesting there in verse 8. We are just out of time. Let's stop right there, and Lord willing, we'll pick it up there next Sunday morning, again with some understanding of the fact that Solomon is in this second part of the third sermon, where he's talking about he's got a right perspective in view at this particular point. Thanks, everybody.